Hello and welcome back to a study of the prophet Daniel, the prophet who lived through Babylonian and Persian times and the captivity of the Jews. My name is Keith Mosher, Sr. I happen to be one of the instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching, and we have been privileged to be there into our 47th year now at the school. We're coming to you from the studios of the Gospel Broadcasting Network, and this work, of course, is worldwide, and folks all over the world will be able to hear this study of Daniel or any of the other books of the Bible by simply clicking on that icon on the GBN website or site on the television. And we come today to the 11th chapter of Daniel. And I want us to think about this chapter as a prophetic view, a vision of the intertestament period. Daniel is given history here that has not yet happened, which is what prophets did. And you will remember that Daniel chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 covered 68 years of the Babylonian captivity. Then when you got to chapter 7, 8, you put them ahead of 5 and 6 chronologically. So I think of Daniel as 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6. Now these chapters, 10, 11, and 12, are a unit. And if I were arranging Daniel chronologically, I would put chapter 9, the very last chapter, which is filled with prophecy about the exact moment when the Christ would be here on earth and what he would do. Chronology, though, is not so important here. What is important is to look at the fact that Daniel is able to see this history by inspiration. God gave him these visions. Now, the LXX Bible, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, done in Alexandria, Egypt, about 250 BC, and the Theodotian text have the word Cyrus at 11:1. We have Darius the Mede in our Hebraic biblical text, which has been used to translate the King James in American Standard Old Testament. So there's confusion, you see, not only in the manuscripts, but in the English text as to the chronology. And some people have tried to date chapter 11 earlier than chapter 10. I look at 10, 11, and 12 as a unit, a study of Darius the Mede as Darius Hystaspes. And I went through a long dissertation for you in another session on why I believe this is who this is, speaking of Darius the Mede. This is not the 62-year-old left in charge of the Babylonian conquered area that Cyrus took. This is Hystaspes. And Hystaspes is the Mede who put down Pseudo-Smyrtus, and he ruled, this man did, from 521 to 485 BC. Now, what I want to do here is to show you from two quotes what the modernists say about what Daniel did here. This is the intertestament period. This is the time in history when the 4 generals of Alexander split his kingdom. And 2 of these generals are very important to Daniel's prophecy: the king of the north and the king of the south. Ptolemaic Egypt, that's the one down south. Seleucid Syria, that's the king up north. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Ptolemaic kings mentioned in Daniel's prophecy. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Seleucid kings that will be brought to light in Daniel's prophecy. A total of 14 people in the intertestament period. Ptolemy, Egypt. Seleucid, Syria. south, north. And we're going to read about the kings of the north and south in Daniel's prophecy here. And so this is the intertestament period. However, there are those that take the view that this text, all of it, from Daniel chapter 1 through Daniel chapter 12, all of this was written in the intertestament period. Why do they say that? Because they cannot, for the life of them, understand how this man Daniel could see all this. Why? They deny verbal inspiration, these people do. I want to read to you from F.W. Farrar here for a moment. This is a man who is a modernist, and he wrote this. He said, the origin of the book of Daniel shows there's no inspiration. The fulfillment of prophecies is mere imagination. They were written as if it were before the fact. But Daniel 11 was written 169 to 164 BC about Antiochus Epiphanes. Farrar continued to say, but I should like to say the book of Daniel in its present form first saw the light in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. Its 6 magnificent opening chapters were never meant to be regarded in any other light than that of moral and religious haggados. Well, he sees this as some intertestament writer trying to teach the Jews of that time how to walk according to God's light. That's from a series called The Expositor's Bible that was published in 1950 out of New York. On the other, along with that, we have Porteous commentary, Porteous. Porteous wrote, the whole book, he's talking about Daniel, as we have it, belongs to a few years, 164 to 167, to 164, or possibly 169 to 164, but it must have been completed before the rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabeus and the death of Antiochus. That's from the Old Testament library, published in 1965. Why write that kind of thing? It's a denial of the verbal inspiration of the Scriptures. And these kinds of commentaries are out there all over the place. I was quite amused one time to hear a sister say in one of my classes, you know, Brother Mosher, the Bible sheds a lot of light on these commentaries. I had to tell her I thought that was correct. We have 2 chapters here that we're going to try to cover in these last sessions, chapters 11 and 12. And this is a survey of the intertestament period, but it's pre-history, before it ever happened. Daniel sees it in a vision. I tell my students when we're studying Isaiah, for instance, to imagine yourself sitting in a movie theater watching these things on the screen, and they haven't happened yet. But you're seeing them. That's what these prophets were going to going through when they went before God and he gave them these visions. In fact, the book of Isaiah starts with the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos. The vision there, D-A-B-A-R, Davar, a supernatural vision. The word itself tells us that this word came from God. Well, what Daniel is going to see here is history recorded for us in 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees about the intertestament period. And he starts with Darius Hystaspes. And we're going to have an angel, again, continue these thoughts. And here we're told that somebody stood to confirm and strengthen him. Well, that has to be Michael, the archangel of Israel, evidently, or some angel had rendered some form of assistance to Darius Hystaspes. What he gave him, we're not told, except to strengthen him. Why that was necessary? Well, he helped Darius carry out the decree of Cyrus that the Jews could return to Israel. And the angel and one king are all God needed to providentially allow the Jews to return. And so we start in verse 1 with a statement about Hystaspes, that the Jews are going to be allowed to go back home. You remember that Daniel had already seen their return, so we have a problem with the chronology, of course, but not necessary to understanding of this text. But you remember that when they got back there, they were stopped in the work for 16 years, which troubled Daniel. Now, we're going to read about 3 kings here in Persia. Verse 2. I'm going to suggest this is Cambyses, son of Cyrus, Pseudo-Smyrtus, and Hystaspes. Let's read verse 2 now. Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrtus, Hystaspes, Darius the Mede, and we are in Persia, remember. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Well, God's providence. What a wonderful thought. The psalmist in the long ago told us, this is the 103rd Psalm, and this is the 20th verse of that psalm. Something about God's providence. And I'm always wondering about that and how God works out these things. Thou makest darkness, and it is night. Wherein all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. God's providence. He made the dark. Not a miracle. Ordinary idea there. He made it. He controls it. He is the one in charge of it. God's providence is an interesting thought. In fact, this preacher believes in the very special providence of God because of what we're told, Matthew 6:33, that if we put first in our hearts the seeking of the kingdom of God, God will provide. This happens to be Psalm 34:7. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivers them. Well, here we have an angel strengthening Hystaspes and telling him about 3 kings and then a 4th one who's going to be very rich. The 4th king here, the richest one, we know as Xerxes. He's the Ahasuerus of Esther's time, Esther 1:1. He ruled in Persia from 486 to 465 BC. His father was Darius II. Darius II was chased home after he tried to attack Greece. And he got to the area of Marathon, and in the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks sent him back where he had started, 490 BC. A rebellion in Egypt precluded Darius from returning to Greece. He had to go down there and put down that rebellion in Egypt. Then, when he got through with Egypt, he went back to go against Greece again. If you look at Esther 1:3 and 4, you'll read about a feast in Ahasuerus times that lasted 6 months. A party for 6 months. Can you imagine? To celebrate his riches. This guy is so rich, he's got a 6-month party just to celebrate how rich he is. But if you look at Esther 1:6, you'll find out that they had a problem at that party. And that problem led to the introduction to us of Queen Esther. Persian law could not be changed. And Persian law provided that a Persian king could not march his army until he had named a successor. Well, Darius II had 3 sons by a lady who was the daughter of Gobraz. Then he had 4 sons by a lady named Atosa, who was the daughter of Cyrus. So he had 2 different wives and 7 sons. Which one's going to be his successor? The 3 by Gobraz and 4 by Atosa. But remember, Atosa is the daughter of Cyrus. The oldest of the first 3 who were sons of Gobraz's daughter was Artobazona. Xerxes was the oldest of the second 4. And Darius named Xerxes, the oldest of the second 4 now, as the heir. Why? He's related to Cyrus. Smart when your father-in-law, one of your father-in-laws, is head of the country. So you make Xerxes the king. Cyrus, of course, had started the Persian Empire. When I read about Xerxes from Herodotus, an ancient historian, I get the impression that that rich king there we're reading about had great plans to take Greece. In fact, he wanted to bridge the Hellespont and march through Europe to take Greece. He wanted to conquer Europe too. This is the plans of this man. He had, according to Herodotus, upwards of a 5 million man army. Greek monuments that we know about from that period tell us that the Greeks fought 2 million of Xerxes' army at Thermopylae. I do know that from Herodotus, Xerxes had 300 boats at Salamis. I do know that Xerxes entered Athens, and those 300 boats came to Athens port, and then they had a problem. The sea there is so narrow that the Greeks could fight just a part of that fleet at a time. And they stopped it. The Greeks won at Thermopylae. And that is a great time in history. It's been written about by so many people have made plays about that fight. Well, Xerxes fled home in a fishing boat. His fleet had been destroyed. Storms got what the Greeks didn't. And Xerxes went home to Susa. He shall stir up against the realm of Greece. That's rather understated, isn't it? Xerxes wanted to take that country so badly, and he never was able. But he did something else. He decided, since he couldn't take Greece, he'd go into North Africa. And he did take what is now called Libya, Cyprus. He took that place, and he founded some defenses for Egypt. He is the king of the south, 306 to 304. Turner had him as from 306 to 284. Good has him as from 323 to 282. But in that area is where we're looking at this king. The Ptolemaic dynasty that we're going to read about now lasted for about 3 centuries. Ptolemy Soter, 323 to 283 BC. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, 282 to 248 BC. Ptolemy III, Euergetes, we'll read about him, 246 to 222 BC. Notice where we are in history. This is one of the generals, Ptolemy was, of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, these 4 generals split up his kingdom. Well, there were more than 4, but they fought for 20 years, and finally 4 of them won the day. And Ptolemy was one of them, and he took Egypt. And in 221, Ptolemy IV, Philopator, took over. Then in 201, Epiphanes took over, Ptolemy V. Ptolemy VI is called Philometor, 180 to 145. He had a co-regency with his mother, Cleopatra, and his brother, Ptolemy VIII. All right, that's the Ptolemaic kingdom. The Ptolemaic dynasty lasted 3 centuries. Greek veterans of the army of Alexander were actually given land. And incidentally, the Ptolemy that we're talking about here, Ptolemy I, who is called Soter, S-O-T-E-R, this man gave land to the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. And it's out of Alexandria, Egypt, that the Greek translation of the Old Testament originated. Because of the Jewish population there that could not speak Hebrew anymore, they spoke Greek. Well, that area was granted them by Ptolemy Soter. Both the Greeks and the Jews thought of themselves as a higher kind of person from the Egyptian. They looked at the Egyptians as inferior to them. The Jews in Alexandria, Egypt had their own council of elders with a president, ethnarch. Ptolemy Soter, Soter means savior, a title of Ptolemy that he received when he rescued the island of Rhodes from a rival general in 304 BC. He saved that island from the other Greek generals, and he's called Ptolemy Soter, savior. The Jewish Council of Elders that started in Alexandria, Egypt, is actually a forerunner of the Sanhedrin you read about in your New Testament. The council could enforce instruction, Torah, that would be Genesis through Deuteronomy. It could keep foreign cults out of that area in Alexandria, and in essence just conduct their own businesses. The Ptolemies that we're going to read about here established Greek settlements all over Egypt and around Judea. And they called that area Decapolis. You're going to read about that in Jesus' time in the New Testament. And when you think about this area of the world now, where the Ptolemies are, I want you to think about that they are intermingling, the Jews and the Greeks are. And the Hellenistic Jew, the Greek-thinking Jew, is getting this influence down here in Egypt. Verse 4, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled for his coming shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. The prince of verse 5 is our first Seleucid king now. He's called the king here, as strong of the south, one of his princes above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. This is Nicator. Now let's go over the Seleucid kings. This is Nicator, 312 to 281 BC. Antiochus the first, Soter, savior. 281 to 261. Antiochus II, Theos, he called himself God, 261 to 248. Seleucus II, he's called Calinius, 246 to 225. Seleucus III, Soranus, that's 226 to 222. Antiochus III, we'll have to pay attention to him. He's called the Great, 222 to 187. Philopater, Seleucus IV, and then finally Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and we're going to pay attention to him, 175 to 164. This is a general, this first king. He's a strong one. He was a satrap of Babylonia at one time under Alexander. Antigonus was able to push this Nicator out in 315 BC. And this guy, Nicator, this first Seleucid king, fled down to Ptolemy to ask him for help in 312 BC. 10 years later, a final battle occurred between all those generals, and in 302 BC, they finally had decided there were just 4 left, and one is Ptolemy, one is Seleucus, Lysimachus, we won't pay much attention to him, and Cassander, defeated Antigonus at a place called Ipsos, and here were 150,000 Greeks fighting each other to divide up Alexander's kingdom. And these people used war elephants when they fought, and the 4, when they defeated Antigonus, divided up his territory among themselves. And so you have Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Syria, Lysimachus and Cassander in other places. Modern Lebanon and Syria. Modern Lebanon and Syria, that's the Seleucid area. Seleucus went on to claim much territory from Turkey all the way over to the Indus River. He built his city, Seleucia. He possessed a great dominion. Verse 5 tells us he would. And some think his son moved the entire population of Babylon to Seleucia. I don't know about that, but that'd be quite a thing. 120 miles south of modern Baghdad. That's why he's called the king of the south here, although his Syrian area is north of Egypt. Seleucus fought Lysimachus for Asia Minor and won. He then invaded Lysimachus area in Europe and took a portion of Thrace, modern Bulgaria. So this guy had a lot of territory. In fact, Seleucus was from Bulgaria. He was a Thracian. I want to back up now to verse 3 for a moment. A mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his rule. This mighty king is a reference to Alexander the Great. Everyone I know in any commentator will tell you this has to be Alexander, because in verse 4 we're told that his territory is scattered to the 4 winds. We know that 4 generals eventually took over his territory. You remember that Alexander the Great's father had developed a volunteer army in Macedonia. And these men could travel for 3 days with all of the food and equipment that each one carried. And so they were trained to march long distances. And in Philip of Macedon, in his day, Persia was the threat, of course. Well, there was a man named Isocrates who lived during this period in Greece or Macedonia, and he was telling the Greek city-states, unite. Well, they finally did in Macedonia, and they declared Philip to be their king. In 338 BC now, you have Philip of Macedon ruling Macedonia. Philip got married to a lady named Olympias. She was the sister of a city king named Epirus. And to that union of Philip and Olympia, Alexander the Great was born. Philip didn't behave himself in his marriage. In fact, he was unfaithful to Olympia many times. And Olympia didn't like it. And she's a very outspoken lady, according to the historians. Well, Philip divorces her. He marries a young daughter of one of his generals. He marries Attalus, Attalus, at the wedding of his daughter. At the wedding of his daughter. Later, Philip is assassinated by one of his own soldiers, Pausanias. Many historians will argue that Olympia had arranged that assassination. Don't know that, but some think that Olympus had gotten this soldier to kill Philip. When Alexander was just in his late teens, this is 334 BC now, his dad's dead, and so he decides, I'll just take this army and go against Persia. And he does, and in 3 major battles, he defeats Persia. And this is a great military man now. And he gets all the way to the Indus River. He's in India. And he's in Pakistan. Today, he'd be in Pakistan. And his soldiers got tired. And his elephant soldiers told him, we're tired. Let's stop. And so Alexander stops and he retreats to Babylon and he dies there, 33 years old. Suddenly. Don't know what had killed him. Something. That's 323 BC. When you look at Isaiah chapter 23 and you look at Ezekiel chapter 26 and you talk about their conquests and so on, you're in the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander met at one time in his life a Jewish high priest. And he allowed the temple to stand because of that priest. Alexander conquered Egypt, parts of Russia, and his tired army said, that's enough. When you think about the time of Alexander the Great, and you read Galatians 4:4, and you think about the fullness of time, and you wonder why we're studying all this history, why do I need to know about all this Alexander the Great and his 4 generals and all those Ptolemies and Seleucids? There's a reason. The Greeks were used by God, that time in history, to give 3 things to us that help to make it the right time in history for the Messiah to come. Babylon gave us the synagogue and worship. And had they had the Lord's Supper in the synagogue, they would have had New Testament worship. So the Babylonian influence by Ezekiel of making those synagogues, giving the Jews a place to worship since the temple was destroyed. Now we have the forerunner of New Testament worship. But the Greeks encouraged society to merge. And when the Christ came, you had people from all over the world just in one city. They could take that message all over the world. Number 2, you had Greek culture and philosophy now. Not barbarism like Rome, but Greek culture. And most important, you've got a universal language. Everybody was speaking Greek. And so when you have that kind of a situation, it's much easier for the messianic message to spread. And so when you study this period, remember, this is the background. This is the background now to the coming of Messiah. Now, let's go back to verse 5. The king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. The Ptolemies down in Egypt would do battle with folks up here and go through Palestine. The Seleucids would be doing battle and go through Palestine. They had had trouble with the Egyptians. Assyria went through there. Babylon went through there. Greece went through there. Persia went through there. You just have all of these armies constantly going through this area. That's why your Bible that says the people that sat in darkness, not spiritual darkness, military darkness, saw a great light. Matthew writes about this, chapter 4, and he tells us that that's the area where the Messiah will come. This area that's constantly afflicted by war will be the area in which the Messiah comes. War was inevitable in this area. And during the time Daniel is prophesying, the two sides, Ptolemies and Seleucids, would engage in 6 wars. In 274, that's between verses 5 and 6. They had a war. At the end of verse 6, they had another war. That's 260 to 253. In verses 7 through 9, there's a third war. Verses 10 through 12, a fourth war. Verses 13 through 17, a fifth war. Verses 25 through 27, a sixth war. The Ptolemies down in Egypt defended themselves quite well. And they would actually seek territory to defend Egypt as a kind of defense wall around Egypt. They were also trying to defend the interests of the Greeks who settled there in Egypt. Well, the Seleucid Empire was much more diverse from the Ptolemaic. It was managed by numerous satraps, not so militarily inclined just for defense, more inclined for offense, the Seleucids. And they actually had more rebellion, the Seleucids did, in their empire than the Ptolemies. And they were constantly, the Seleucid kings, putting down these rebellions. So you've got a kind of area of strife, an area that's more interested in defending itself. And now we're going to read about a royal marriage. Verse 6, chapter 11. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. A royal marriage. That's Bernice in Egypt, and Antiochus of Syria. Ptolemy had, and the Seleucid had just been engaged in the second war, the Second Syrian War. And they had, the Ptolemies had expanded their coastline all the way to Asia Minor. And the fellow I told you about, Philadelphus, had developed a fleet of 300 ships, much like the Persians. Well, this second war actually ended without any new territory for either side. And when they concluded the fighting in 253 BC, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, agreed to give his daughter, Bernice, in marriage to Antiochus Theos, the one who called himself God, Antiochus II. Theos divorced his first wife, Laodice, and he agreed with the Ptolemies to disinherit his two sons if Bernice had a son. She did in 249 BC. Philadelphus died in 246 BC, 3 years after that son was born. And that summer, when he died, there were some suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. Maybe he was assassinated. And he died in the home of Laodice, his first wife. He died in the home of his first wife? Well, a little suspicious. She claimed, Laodice did, that he had named his son Seleucus II Callinicus as heir. Bernice is down in Antioch, refused to relinquish her own son's claim. The two queens went to war. She shall not retain the power of the arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her root shall one stand up in his state, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Bernice summoned her brother, Ptolemy III, recently crowned, to help. He found Bernice and her son murdered in Antioch. He prevailed. Laodice had ordered them to be murdered. He came with his army. He entered into the fortress. They're dead. The one who claimed the throne for her own son is dead, and the son is. You don't suppose Laodice had taken revenge on Philadelphus because he had divorced her for that younger girl. The shoot from her, Bernice's, shall one in his place be. Well, that was her brother. Bernice's brother took over when Philadelphus died. Ptolemy III replaced Ptolemy II. Euergetes took Philadelphus' place. And he moved, watch, and shall also carry captives into Egypt. Their gods with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and gold shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return unto his own land. The king here plundered Syria, but the empire was too big for total conquest. So he goes back to Egypt, that's Euergetes now, with much spoil. Vessels of silver and of gold, and Daniel saw all of that. Isn't that something? In 245 BC. Some historians have Euergetes reaching all the way to Babylon before he went back to Syria. We do know he regained the eastern coastland from Ptolemy before he returned from the folks there in the east before he returned. And he emerged from the third Syrian war now, that's the third one, with a stronger empire. Ptolemy III, Euergetes, outlived the Seleucus II by several years. And Ptolemaic Egypt outlasted the Seleucid Empire itself. The King James Version is the most accurate text about this period that we've just described for you of any of the Bibles. Isn't that interesting? It's the most accurate. When Ptolemy returned with so much bounty back to Egypt, Euergetes was called that. And Euergetes means benefactor. He shared all of that he had taken with them. And so you have here a prophecy of the third Syrian war between Ptolemy and Seleucid. Now, the sons of the Seleucids start the fourth war. Let's get verse 10. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through, then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. Now we're told that a Seleucid, and we know this to be Calenius, starts the fourth war. Antiochus the Great is over there now in the Seleucid Empire. Well, Calenius had a problem. He fell off his horse and died in the battle. Well, he's succeeded by Antiochus when Antiochus is only 15. But he will eventually control Egypt. The empire was weak when he started. One shall come and overflow and pass through. But he built it up again. So you have here a reference to Calenius, who died, and his son Antiochus, who takes the throne in Egypt. Now verse 11. The conclusion of that fourth war. The king of the south shall be moved with choler, anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, Calenius, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. Ptolemy the fourth. Now Ptolemy the fourth is Philopater. He has succeeded Euergetes. And he had a huge army. According to history, this king had 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, 73 war elephants. Well, his opponent, Antiochus the Great, assembled 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 102 war elephants, and watch this, and 10,000 Arabs. But the Ptolemy from Egypt, Philopater, defeated Antiochus at Raphia. That's very near the Gaza place that we call today the Gaza Strip. Seleucus lost 10,000 soldiers there. Ptolemy only lost 1,500. Calenius lost all of his elephants, Antiochus the Great lost all of his elephants. He lost 300 cavalry, and 4,000 prisoners were taken. Ptolemy only lost 700 cavalry and 16 elephants. Antiochus sued for peace and retreated back to Antioch, Syria. And Ptolemy settled his army in western Syria. You have the conclusion of the fourth war, verse 11. Antiochus remembered that defeat. Antiochus the Great did. And he didn't like it that the treaty he had to make gave Ptolemy control of that part of Syria. That stayed on Antiochus the Great's mind. He was seeking, of course, revenge. Now we come to verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. Antiochus the Great didn't like it. and he shall cast down many 10,000, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army with much riches. Oh, he's very angry toward Antiochus the Great. Philopater is. This guy made war with me, and I've taken most of his army captive. And old Philopater goes back home, and he's all reveling in his triumph. He was able to give 300 pieces of gold to his soldiers, but he didn't pursue Antiochus. What happened? Philopater was lifted up. He became a drunk. His heart will be lifted up. And he spent years not pursuing Antiochus. While meanwhile, Antiochus the Great rebuilt his army. He restored much of his army and the empire to the east. And 14 years later, old Philopater is now dead. Ptolemy Epiphanes is on the throne at 4 years of age. So here's Antiochus the Great, who had been beaten by Philopater, who became a drunk, died, facing a 4-year-old Ptolemy down in Egypt. For the kingdom of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude. Well, 14 years later now, this is verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. The robbers of the people shall exalt themselves to establish the division, but they shall fail. Philopater's dead. There's a 4-year-old on the throne in Egypt. And Antiochus is bent on recovering Syria and Palestine from Ptolemy. Arisno III served as regent. His mom did. Arisno III, that's the mother of Ptolemy, who is 4 years old. Well, she's assassinated. Here's his mom now trying to be the co-regent by a court official who took power. So Egypt is now weakened. They don't have the Ptolemy actually on the throne, a court official is. And so there's a lot of internal strife down there. And so 15. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will. None shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Now you have the fifth war. The fifth war. And Antiochus wanted Egypt to surrender. He actually marched into Egyptian territory. But while he's doing that, Philip V of Macedonia opened a second front against the Seleucids. He actually took a Ptolemaic naval base on the island of Samos. He took Egypt's holdings in Thrace, Bulgaria. He also sent ambassadors, Egypt sent ambassadors to him, to a rising power in Rome to try to help against Greece. But Rome at the time had just finished the Punic War, the Second Punic War, against Hannibal and Carthage, so they weren't ready to help down there in Egypt. The appeal from Egypt led Rome, however, to look eastward for more conquering. There's an interesting providence there, that then God is controlling something. When the Ptolemaic people sent ambassadors to Rome, That opened out Rome's eyes. We ought to take that territory. Well, you've got the fifth war here, verse 15. Now, the boy king, but he that cometh against him shall go according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. The boy king commissioned a man named Scopas to be his commander against the Seleucids, and a stalemate was broken in 200 BC by Antiochus the Great, who defeated Scopas near what was called later Caesarea Philippi. The Egyptians fled behind the walls of Sidon. Well, Antiochus besieged Sidon, forced Scopas to surrender. The Jews got excited about what happened there to the Philistines and received Antiochus the Great as a hero. And they provided for his forces down there in Jerusalem. The Seleucid rule, however, in Palestine would become brutal. And Daniel's going to see that in his prophecy. By 201 BC now, the Seleucids ruled most of Syria and Palestine, and they will become brutal dictators. The resolution of the fifth Syrian war is verse 17. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. This shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither he for them. Antiochus retook Syria, took Palestine, could have marched into Egypt, but Roman interdiction caused Antiochus to do something else. The Roman Senate realized that the pact between the kings threatened the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. And so Antiochus, thinking the Jews would help him against Egypt, be glad that he was there to put an end to the Syrian-Egyptian wars. But now Antiochus the Great is at war with Rome. And the angel has to tell Daniel something. The angel says, there's a problem here. Antiochus would petition Egypt and Syria to merge into one nation. And he thought that would be great protection for him against Rome. We're going to take a look at what happened in the next session. Ever grow.